And so welcome everybody to the April edition of Agile Yorkshire. So it's the first time Agile Yorkshire has ever been a virtual event. It's obviously normally it has been pretty much a monthly event in person since for a good few years now. It's normally at this point that I ask people in the audience in person to give me a whoop. Obviously, that can't happen tonight. You might want to type "whoop" into the chat box to let us know.
I see the chat already.
That you're there. But other than that, welcome. And it's just great to see so many people. Wow, look at that. That's fantastic. Okay, so by way of introduction then, so my name is Roy Brachet, for those of you who may not have met me before. So I'm the co-founder of a consulting business called New Redo. My day job is supporting the New Redo team of consultants and developers. And tonight I'm the Agile Yorkshire host again. I'm not always, but I am again tonight. We've got two amazing top-class speakers tonight, Jutta Eckstein and Matthew Skelton, who I'll be introducing shortly, plus we're assisted by Steve Trapps, who many of you will already know as an experienced Agile coach and Scrum trainer. But tonight, he will be our quiz master.
Way!
Indeed. So I'm going to be introducing our speakers shortly, but just a little bit about how we're going to run tonight. We're on a fairly tight schedule, obviously. There's going to be a gap. We're going to have Jutta's going to speak first. We're going to have a gap between or just after each speaker with a few minutes for questions. It's useful if there's a Q&A panel. For those of you who've not used Zoom before, there's a Q&A panel that you've got access to. If you've got questions and you'd like the speakers to answer them, please type in that Q&A panel. I'd also sort of ask you to try and keep the Q&A panel just for questions to make it a bit easier to read. After both our speakers, we'll move on to our quiz. So we've got 3 quick fire rounds of questions. We're using the Quizbit platform. If anybody's not seen that before, it's a Leeds-based team, so you can give them a bit of love if you enjoy the quiz tonight. And there are some alcohol-based prizes. I think we're going to be sending out at least prizes for the first 25. So it's a real quick fire round. I won't go into the details because Steve will talk about that, but it's very quick, very snappy. It's hopefully not going to be too dull. Hopefully a whole stack of fun. And at the end, I'll just wrap up and remind everybody that we've got some feedback that we send out. There's also some prizes there. Just before we crack on, I just ask everybody to be a little bit patient. If there are any network glitches, if any of our speakers go offline or we have a bit of a disaster, I'm sure they'll fight their way back on. And then also I just want to say a quick thank you to our headline sponsors, William Hill and Corcom, who obviously alongside the New Redo team, they're the people that provide what's necessary to make Agile Yorkshire happen in the way it does do. And then just before I introduce Jutta, I'm just going to remind everybody as well that this week is the Leeds Digital Festival Week. So for those of you that don't know the Leeds Digital Festival, it's just about the largest festival of its kind in the UK with hundreds and hundreds of events. I don't know exactly how many this year, but there were certainly in the hundreds anyway. It's obviously this year it's in stealth mode due to the lockdown, but obviously it's still a huge celebration of the kind of digital economy in our region, and there's still 2 days to run. There's plenty of fantastic events to enjoy, so hey, go and look at the website and check that out. Okay, so that just leads me on to introduce our first speaker tonight, Jutta Eckstein. she is a super prolific author with several books to her name. I would encourage you to go to Amazon and just to have a look at the titles she's already written. There are lots. I'm sure she'd love you to buy some as well. I first came across Jutta probably a good many years ago now, about the time we first started New Redo, in fact, because she wrote a book called Agile Software Development with Distributed Teams. It was the first, I think it was published in 2010. It was the first book I'd really ever read on distributed teams. I was particularly interested in it at the time because we just started New Redo and couldn't afford an office. She's also obviously a vastly experienced independent coach, consultant, and trainer. She served on the board of the Agile Alliance. So she's going to be talking to us tonight about distributed teams. And so without waffling on anymore, I'm going to hand over to Jutta.
Thank you so much. Wow, what an introduction. Okay, so I start sharing my screen, which hopefully works now. I guess you see something. And I want to start off with a question. So if you can use your mobile or browser and go to menti.com and use the code that's shown here, 477434, and then answer these questions. And you answer those by clicking on the bar, so it's kind of like a slider. And I have these two questions for you. Are you currently working remotely with your team, and from never to like always? And the other question is, before Corona, have you been working remotely with your team? Never, always. And as we can see for the first few answers, there's also the possibility to do something in between. So again, menti.com, and the code is 477434. So I wait a little bit till we get a few more results, but the trend shows already here, I would say. Although people are still replying, nothing really changes anymore. It seems a slightly bit. So it is really super clear that at the moment, it seems everyone is working remotely with the team and more or less all the time. And before Corona, some did, some didn't. And so it was kind of an in-between thing. So thank you so much for answering this. This is amazing. Wow. So I move on, and this helps me, of course, kind of, knowing in which direction we are going here. So I don't need to say a lot about this because of this great introduction by Roy. I know that I've been invited, especially today, because of this Agile software development with distributed teams. And yes, I've written some more books. The latest one has that cool acronym, Bossa Nova. So you might want to check it out just because the acronym is so cool. Anyway, so this is not what I'm talking about today. What I want to talk about, or mainly what's the focus of the session today, is kind of what can maybe distributed, maybe not, Agile team learn from working remotely, and also the other way around, how can working remotely be improved by focusing on agility? So these are the two things I want to tackle here. For the context, and I hope you can bear with me here, and that's maybe important for me more than for you, I'm not sure, because I'm coming from that distributed world. And I want to first set it straight that we differentiate between distributed and dispersed teams. Maybe you have never heard this before, but I'm pretty sure it will be clearer later on, and also why it's important. So for distributed teams, what we understand as that is teams that are in itself co-located, but they work together with another team that's sitting somewhere else. So in this picture that you are seeing, these are the two teams surrounded by the solid circle. So those would be two teams that are distributed in the sense that they are not residing on the same location, and each of the members of each of the teams, they are co-located. Then the other thing, what's existing are dispersed teams. And for a dispersed team, actually, you have like the team in itself is, if you will, distributed. So you have members sitting at different locations. And coming back to like where I'm coming from, before Corona, most often I had exactly a setting as you see it right here. So some of the teams, they were co-located but working together with others somewhere else, and also some of the teams were dispersed, and all of that together was like all those different teams are working on the same system. So this is kind of my background. However, this is not what we see right now. What we see right now is different kinds of dispersed teams, and now I want to dive into those as well. So what we know from kind of before Corona times, we had dispersed teams in a way which is called a satellite, which I think is a really terrible thing. So you have a group of people residing on one location, and then the poor, lonely guys sitting somewhere else. Sometimes it's just one person sitting somewhere else. So that's called a satellite. Then we have as another thing, something that's called clusters. And for the clusters, you have just small amounts or little groups of people sitting somewhere at a different location. All of them together again form the dispersed team. Now, as you probably know, what we see right now is something else, which is more something like that. And that's called a nebula. Because you have nowhere a grouping of people, you have everyone sitting by him herself, and this is making the team, and there isn't hardly any like boundary around. So what we are talking about now in Corona days is nebula teams, and this is one variation of dispersed teams. And the kind of the context is important. Once Corona is over, what we all hope at one point, and then also what can you take back to other settings maybe. Now I want to start into what are the learnings from working remotely. One is, and I kind of feel like this is one of the most important thing here, is the mutual respect that I'm seeing right now. And what I mean with this is that in all those nebula teams, everyone is remote now. And if this is not the case, for example, if you have satellites or you have clusters or whatever, what you can see then is, or mainly here then, is that people are referring to the remote people, or they say like, well, and we're on the headquarters, and then those from the other side or working at the other side, or so kind of making clear there's somewhere and here and somewhere there, which is not true anymore because we are all remote. And then you can even put the remote in quotes, because what does it mean then? It's useless. So this also means then in terms of the language we are using, we are respecting each other and we are on equivalent level. And I think this is really super, super important. And I absolutely hope that we keep that. With that comes another thing, which is that we typically use the same bandwidth right now. We have the same infrastructure, which is different, again, if some people are grouped together and others are somewhere else. Because then you often have the people who are grouped together in one room having a super high bandwidth. They see each other, they can even touch each other. Oh, God forsake, we are not allowed to do that, of course. But so they have a different kind of closeness than people who are connected. And the connection also varies. So sometimes you have people just connected via audio, sometimes with video, sometimes whatever, maybe you use avatars or anything. But now for the Nebula teams, what we are having is everyone using the same bandwidth, which also means we are in the same way close to each other. And again, that's something that I hope we will keep and accept. And maybe I want to give you here also one example, which for me is often an important thing on like before or after the pandemic, when working on a distributed team or well, teams or dispersed team. The thing is that I often for meetings ask that we really all use the same bandwidth, because it allows us again to mutually respect ourselves. And it's not that there are some like hidden signals going on somewhere and other people don't get what's going on at a different site. So here it's like, as we can see right now and as we can learn from the Nebula right now, is that we all get the same information at the same time, and that makes a huge difference. Then, which is maybe interesting, the thing about everyone gets heard. People often don't think about this that way, or at least that's what I often see, is in a Nebula, it's, I think, much easier to balance all the voices. Of course, you have to ensure that this is really happening, but if you are meeting in just a co-located Agile team, what's often happening there is that you have, for example, some extroverts or some even loudmouths who are speaking the whole time, and there are some people who never get heard. And for a Nebula team, the easiest thing for all the meetings that you can do is just you take turns. So using a round robin fashion. So most often what we do is we kind of look at who's in that meeting, and then kind of the facilitator, whoever that is, that could be just a team member, writes down the order of how that person sees people on the screen and then calls out everyone. And so everyone gets the same amount to speak and also gets a chance to speak. And sometimes that's really making a huge difference, because all of a sudden you are hearing from people you never heard before. So maybe this is also one advice already. If you're not doing something like this with your remote teams, I really advise you to do that. Don't use any kind of plenary style thing, because you will not hear from people. And this is here right now, your big chance to actually do that, to hear from everyone. Now, looking at learnings from Agile for remote. So for some of the now Nebula teams, it works pretty well, because that team has been working together co-located before Corona popped up. And so the trust was already there. And the trust, well, there's this one saying, trust needs touch, which is true. But what's also true for an Agile team is that we focus very much on communication and collaboration. And there's no reason not doing so for any remote team. So on any Nebula team, any dispersed team, whatever setting you are having at the moment, again, I just assume it's all Nebula here. And so the important thing is really to keep doing that. Often when people start working in a setting like that, they think like, okay, well, now we don't see and hear each other. Everything has to be in writing. Well, there are stuff that are good in writing, but not everything. So communication, collaboration is still super important, maybe even more so. Then another thing for an Agile team, it's, well, typically, if it's really working as an Agile team, it is aligned. So we have a cross-functional team that has the same goal. Or maybe let's put it the other way around. If there is no joint goal, I would argue there is no team really. And so the thing that really brings the team together is this joint goal. And well, if you're co-located, it's quite easy to tell. For example, if you are in a stand-up meeting and, well, you can already see that people are all bored and they feel like it's a waste of time, then it's super likely that the reason is that they are not having a joint goal and they just wonder what the others are talking about because they have no clue about that and they are not interested in it at all. So an Agile team has a joint goal, and that's a reason why now going remote works for many teams quite smoothly. And if you are starting with the Nebula team, with a remote team, then you have to really pay attention to that you also have that joint goal and everyone understands that. Another super important thing is still to continue learning. So doing retrospectives now virtually, of course, and using those to make your shared values explicit. But I even find more important now is, well, for an Agile team in a retrospective, you kind of come up with your shared agreements, with your guidelines, kind of the things, how do we work together? That has a different twist for a Nebula team, because you would need, or I recommend you to have guidelines, team agreements that also cover all the remote aspects, like what are good times to reach somebody or not, because, well, maybe the kids are really needing the attention at a given point in time or not, or are there any kind of signals that you need to have so people know all of a sudden that, well, this might not be good right now, or what are tools that are really good for everyone. So you need kind of different team agreements or additional ones to the ones that you are having as an Agile team, and you can really, in a really good way, use retrospectives for that. Of course, virtual ones, and there are different team tools that are supporting that. I'm just naming a few. They're all cool and great, and of course you can also just use I don't know, something like Google Drawing or a shared doc or anything. So it's not that you have to have a tool like that, but they're pretty cool anyway. So I see that I sped up really a lot, and I'm coming already to the end, which means that I am hoping for a really great question, and I want to close that with something that I think is super important to understand, which is that working remotely is really a trouble detector. So whatever kind of problems you had in your team before you started as a Nebula team, they will amplify. And it will be hard to be ignored, to ignore those problems any longer. So therefore, you really have to pay attention on what's going on there and work with that. So this is it from my side, except that, yeah, it is a good thing to know about these things. And the other thing is that I want to announce that I've put out a discount on the Distributed Teams book. So here's the link, and you will get the slide in case you don't get the link right now. Yeah, so this is it. So I guess I stop the screen share and we go to question and answers.
Thank you very much, Jutta. Okay, let me just flip to the Q&A panel.
I see one in the Q&A.
Yeah. Jutta, can you, so this is from Diana, can you speak to the need for a quick rechartering for Nebula teams that were previously co-located or satellites?
Mm-hmm. Well, it would be cool to have Diana speaking to that, because, and hi Diana, it's really cool that you're here. She's kind of one of the inventors of the Agile chartering, and yes, that's really true. That's kind of also what I was talking about, like that you, with the retrospectives, you have to come up with a new set of team agreements, or maybe some of them are additions to that, and maybe also your goal might have another twitch with, like, now that we are all in this Nebula team. So yes, a quick rechartering, and the way I have seen it or doing it is still using the retrospective for it. But if you feel like it's something that's a bigger thing, then you might have a separate meeting for that. So and the charter, well, Dana should probably better explain that, but the charter is kind of, what is it we are working on? How do we know that we are moving towards our goal? And what do we need in order to work together successfully so that we can reach that? And so this is kind of a quick summary of that. And yeah, check out Diana's books, and yeah, you will find it.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. I'm just going to the next question from Anch. So just to summarize, they say that, you know, the personal touch, they miss the personal touch when we're from being in a single room together, like standing up and writing something on a wall spontaneously. How do you kind of, you know, what's your advice about replacing that when everybody's working remotely?
Yeah, so luckily this is a question that's not only addressing Nebula teams, it's any kind of dispersion you might have, is that we always had really good experiences with any kind of instant messaging being open all the time. Other teams, they have also some kind of video running the whole time. My teams often didn't like that the whole time on, but instant messaging is something where people keep these things. Also having shared docs, if it's allowed, and I'm sorry, I don't really want to advertise that, but the way how the Google Docs, how Google Drawings and all of that are working is really great. However, for a lot of my clients, Google is a no-go. But if you can use that, then this is really a super easy way to do that. Another thing that I read in this, like you miss the personal touch, is that is really true. And this is also what I meant with the good thing now with the Nebula teams, is that they have been working together beforehand. And so they have created that trust already. It's so much harder if you haven't done that yet. And from all that I know from research, the thing is really, which might sound weird, but it's really the smell that makes the connection. And sometimes we have this also in sayings that, well, yeah, if it doesn't really fit with somebody, then it's kind of the smell. At least in German, we have an idiom going with that. And you cannot replicate it if you are remote. And so you have to have other stuff for kind of catching up with that or making up for that. And not everything is working as well as like the olfactory senses. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just conscious of the time. I know we've got quite a few questions here, but as I say, we are on a bit of a schedule tonight. So I don't know yet if you maybe will have a chance to look through some of these and possibly
I
get
can
back.
enter them in writing.
Yeah, in writing. That's right.
Yes.
That would be fantastic if you can do that. And that then will allow us to move on to our second speaker for tonight. I will obviously say thank you to Jutta for her contribution this evening. And I know, as I say, you can see from the chat, from the question and answer, that there are lots of people that would like to pick Jutta's brains and understand more about this distributed team, the wisdom around the distributed team, working in distributed teams. As I say, time prevents us from spending more time with Jutta now, but so we must just move on. So, okay. It brings us on to our second speaker tonight, Matthew Skelton. So many of you will know Matthew is a member of our community for quite some time now. He's the head of consulting at Conflux, and he's the co-author of a book recently published called Team Topologies that has been extremely well received, I think, fair to say. He's also, I'm just looking at his bio now, recognized by Tech Beacon over the last few years as one of the top 100 people to follow in DevOps. And as I say, many of you will know him as a past speaker at Agile Yorkshire. So because of the time, I'm going to hand over to Matthew quite quickly. And thank you, Matthew.
Great. Thank you, Rod. It's good to be here again. Hi, everyone. I'd like to share with you some ideas that I think are really complementary to the ideas that Jutta's just shared. I think these ideas are going to go very well together. And that's the idea of kind of remote first team interactions. Remote work is just about using Zoom and Slack, isn't that right? That's all there is to it. Well, it turns out that there's a little bit more to it than that. We do need some tools, but we need some ground rules and we need some practices as well. And I'll share some ideas with you in this session now. This is the book that I co-authored. It came out in September 2019, so the front cover looks like that. Co-authored it with Manuel Paish, and it's published by IT Revolution Press. The same publisher has published DevOps Handbook and the book Accelerate, and books like this. So some of the ideas in this presentation today come from the book. We've got some online resources as well that we want to share with you. So we'll talk about team dependencies. We'll talk about setting some team boundaries. We'll talk about what we call purposeful interactions, and then a tiny bit about how we can grow some feedback. So it's worthwhile saying to start with that there are always dependencies, but some dependencies block flow. Other dependencies we don't really think about very much. So in this remote first context, it's really vital to understand who's working on what, so we can understand what our dependencies are. And one of the ideas from the Team Topologies book that we talk about is something called a team API. So if you're familiar with programming, writing software, you'll understand what API is. That's application programming interface. It's a way of defining how to use a component or a service. And we've taken that idea and applied it to the team as well. And you'll see why that kind of works in a minute. So here's a quotation from the book. For effective team-first ownership of software, teams need to continuously define, advertise, test, and evolve their team API. Now, this will seem quite similar to some of the ideas that Jutta's just been talking about, and there's a very good reason for that. The team API, though, is kind of outward-facing, whereas some of the team charter ideas are inward-facing. So the team API is very much outward-facing. What does the team look like from the perspective of other teams that need to interact with that team? So the team API might cover all sorts of things. Artifacts owned by the team, that's services that they build or applications that they build. What's the versioning and testing approach? Where is the wiki or documentation? What kind of practices and principles do we follow? What's our roadmap? And preferences for communication, particularly the last two, when we're working in a remote first approach. How do we wish you to communicate with us? So that we're not dictating ways of communicating, but we're allowing people to understand this particular team prefers to communicate in this way, whereas another team might prefer to communicate in a different way. Just as we'd have different kind of communication API interfaces, if you like, different standards for software, we've got effectively different kind of standards for communicating with different teams. And we've got online on GitHub, we've got an example team API template that you can clone and send as a pull request. You can see that on the screen here. It allows just a suggestion for how you might fill out that information and use it. You're documenting which chat channels you use in the Slack or Teams or something. What kind of team are we? And some of these other kind of questions. Are we part of a platform? These kind of questions here, which make it very straightforward to understand what a team is doing, helps to clarify the purpose. It helps the team members internally to think about their current purpose and their more general purpose, which, as we've heard from Jutta, is a really key aspect of making sure that the team performs like a team. We've also got a tool on GitHub again for helping to track team dependencies. This is based on some work from Spotify. And you'll see a link from the GitHub repository into an example spreadsheet, which helps. It shows an example of how to kind of map out which other teams you depend on and whether that dependency is blocking and so on. So we're bringing this stuff to the surface. We're making it visible. The important thing here is not that we kind of fill in a spreadsheet. It's that we're thinking about our dependencies and how we need to be able to work. There's also a book here, Making Work Visible by Domenica de Grandis. That's also published by IT Revolution, the same publisher as publishes Team Topologies. And in there, there's some really good ideas about, well, as you expect, making work visible, but specifically about tracking dependencies between different teams. Some of the ideas need to be slightly modified for a remote setting, but there's some really, really sound practices in there. So the key thing here is I mean, in general, but particularly in a remote first context, we need to remove blocking dependencies, remove dependencies that where we have to wait on another team in order for us to make progress. We need to remove those. If there are dependencies which are just slow, it takes a long time, then we need to find ways to mitigate or work around them. And there are dependencies which are very healthy, which enable us to deliver what we need to deliver. For example, infrastructure, or a kind of component that we bring in from a third party. And if those work, that's brilliant. Those are healthy dependencies, so we should keep them. But being really conscious about what those dependencies are is really, really important for a team. It's also important as well that we build networks of people, social, if you like, social networks, the kind of networks that we would have inside the office if we went to the coffee machine or the water cooler or the canteen or whatever. We'd meet people, we'd have conversations. Some of those would be kind of accidental, serendipitous, if you like, and we discover things we didn't really know. We discover that there's a lunchtime talk happening tomorrow. Ooh, that sounds really interesting. Maybe I'll go along. So we need to somehow recreate these opportunities for serendipity, these opportunities for discovery and making connections. Some teams deliberately have like a 15-minute coffee break where everyone goes and gets a cup of coffee and everyone's on video chat. We don't talk about work. We talk about whatever we like to talk about with a cup of coffee, as if we were in an office situation in the cafe or the canteen. Or it can just be fine to emphasize to individuals that if you need a coffee break, go and have a coffee break, and people understand that. So it can also be a kind of asynchronous thing. But we should also make sure we're creating additional kind of networks of knowledge and knowledge sharing. So if before the pandemic, before the lockdown, you had lunchtime talks, this is quite a common thing. Perhaps some people call them brown bag talks. If you had that, then continue them. But obviously, we're now continuing them using Zoom or some other kind of video technology instead. But make sure that rhythm and dynamic is still there. The same thing with if you had internal conferences. Make sure those still happen. The feel will be different, but the purpose and the drive will be still there. If you're interested in running internal conferences, I actually co-authored a book last year with Victoria Morgan-Smith. So it's called literally Internal Tech Conferences. If you go to internaltechconf.com, you'll find the details of the book. You'll be able to buy it. It's there on LeanPub. And that's been very helpful for lots of organizations to understand how to get up and running with something like an internal tech conference to help build that kind of community and network. So as part of this, it's important for us to think about the boundaries of teams. What is a team? So we know that a team needs a mission, a joint goal. Otherwise, it's not really a team. But there's a few other things we need to think about as well. And one of the most important is the concept of trust levels within groups of different sizes. So several years ago, the anthropologist Robin Dunbar did quite a substantial amount of work looking at group sizes across many different social contexts, from tribes in Africa and the Amazon, through to looking back at historical records in England, going back to what's called the Doomsday Book. So this is like 1,000 years ago. And lots of other contexts as well, and found some very interesting effective limits on the size of different kind of human groupings. And one of these has become known as the Dunbar's number after Robin Dunbar. So he specifically says in the original kind of work, an individual's social network, that means meaningful relationships, is typically in the order of 100 to 200 individuals. So the number that's often quoted is about 150. And that means that, and this number of about 150 keeps occurring in many different contexts. So in the case of the Doomsday Book in England, the typical size of an English village back in, I can't remember what it was, 1150 or something, was about 150 people. And we see the same kind of numbers appearing in many different contexts. There are also other trust boundaries that are larger, around about 500 people, and trust boundaries that are smaller, around about 50 and about 15 people. And what's really interesting is that Robin Dunbar has actually gone back and revisited his original research based on online social networks. And yes, on Facebook and whatever, you might have like 1,000 friends, but actually, if you look at the data, people typically have strong, useful, meaningful interactions with about 150 people on Facebook. So he's actually revalidated his original research in an online context. And this is really important for thinking about the grouping of different of people inside organizations, and where trust might break down and where trust might be stronger. This becomes increasingly important when we're fully distributed, because we want to maximize the trust so that we can do work as effectively as possible. The interesting thing here is that some of these number boundaries also have been proven by institutions or organizations that have existed for centuries. So, for example, in the military, we get some of these kind of groupings of similar sizes that have been constant since at least Roman times, and if not before. Ben Ford is a very interesting person. He used to be in the Royal Marines in the British military. He's now a software developer. He's got very good. He's seen action, military action in Afghanistan and other places like this, and so he talks about social inflection points, and which are kind of group sizes beyond which the trust changes and the dynamics change. So in the military, we have 8 people, and that's called a section. In the military, there's a group size of about 30 to 50 people called a troop. And there's a group size of about 100 to 150 people called a company. And he maps that to its anthropological equivalent. So 8 people is like a hunting party, 30 to 50 people is like a tribe, and 100 to 150 people is kind of like a village. And so these are trust boundaries which have kind of arisen. They're part of what it means to be human, effectively. So we need to work with them. We need to not ignore them, and expect the kind of trust and ability to work with people to change as we kind of cross those boundaries. So the boundaries there kind of existing around about 5 people, 15, 50, 150, 500 people. You can see there's a rough approximate multiplication by 3 each time. And so we'd expect a group of people of about 15 people to be able to have stronger trust than a group of people of perhaps 25. So the trust within that group of 15 is going to be stronger than the group of 25 people. And we need to think about teams in this context as well. So trust dynamics can change as we cross one of these Dunbar boundaries, if you like. So we're expecting kind of different rules, different kind of feeling, if you like, of working with other people, and sort of non-linear effects. And in a remote first context, we need to apply that to tools like Slack. So if we're using chat and so on, what does that feel like? We should not expect everyone to use the same space. That's the equivalent of having everyone in the same building. And that's the equivalent of having no well thought out kind of trust boundaries. Perhaps instead, we need to think about limiting the size of kind of different groupings using these tools to focus the trust so it does not exceed one of these Dunbar number trust boundaries. That's something to think about. There's some early work happening in this space now with some interesting startups. We're actually working with a couple of startups in this space. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in terms of kind of building and maintaining that trust at multiple different levels in the organization as we go kind of remote first. In the past, with physical contexts, I'm just going to skip forward a few different slides here. But in physical context, we could use a building to separate people out. But we need to be conscious of using online tools in a way which helps us to achieve that same kind of trust and so on. I am going to move on a little bit to this section here. We need to set the context for making sure that we're nurturing and growing feedback and awareness of what's happening with the people around us, with the teams around us. There's a very, very good example of a company called Twilio. They're cloud communications, very successful, based in San Francisco. They use something called Net Promoter Score, which is a kind of feedback mechanism that's often used for online shopping and brands and things like this. But they use that internally. So they have an internal platform, and they use NPS to assess the different software development teams, how well those software development teams like and can use the internal platform. This is just an example, but it's the kind of thing that we need to be putting in place to make sure that we're able to work effectively in a remote context. So we're bringing this information in, we're actively seeking feedback from multiple different places. We're not just kind of hoping it's going to work. We make these interactions very deliberate, designed, if you like, because we can't just expect to bump into people in the office. So there's loads more details in Team Topologies' book. We actually also have coming soon a free workbook for remote teams. So this will be coming out from the same publisher. This is our IT Revolution. We're working on this workbook now, and it will be a free download. So if you're interested, then sign up for our newsletter, or just keep your eye on our Twitter account or LinkedIn and IT Revolution as well, the publisher. So we're going to get this out as soon as possible, basically. So it's useful for as many people as possible. And that's it. Looking forward to the questions. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Okay, I'll just flicked the question and answer panel up. I'm not sure we've got any questions directed at you just yet. I saw there's a couple there that Jutta's answered. If anybody's got any questions for Matthew, please type them now. Yeah, we haven't got any questions just yet. Maybe, I'm sure there will be some things that crop up. Perhaps, Matthew, I'm conscious of the time again. It's we need time for our quiz. Maybe the right thing to do is to, I can see there's a question just come in from Diana. Other than Slack, what other channels do you see working with the numbers?
Other than Slack, what other channels do you see working with the numbers?
So I think she means maybe, the different sizes of people.
Yeah, so I mean, Slack was an example, but any kind of communication tool or medium where, whether it's remote or whether it's in the office, but anything where we might expect more people than one of those Dunbar's numbers, that's a bit of a warning that we might not get the right kind of engagement. So we should be expecting to kind of limit kind of different kinds of conversation and engagement to these Dunbar's number sizes, whether it's in Slack or Teams or different any kind of tool, even the number of people on the floor of an office or the number of people in a building. We should start to think about that being limited to these Dunbar's numbers, so that we don't have a kind of us and them break between different groups of people.
Yeah. Okay. And Helen asks, Matthew, what other behaviors change in people across the boundaries? Example being commitment or.
Good question. So this is again talking about Dunbar's numbers. What seems to happen is as you certainly at the 150 people boundary, that seems to result in a kind of us and them mentality. There's interesting that the clothing manufacturer W.L. Gore, who make Gore-Tex, they're the waterproof material, when one of their offices reaches 150 people, they build a new office next door or in a different town, because they do not want to have an us and them mentality inside any of their offices. And they've actually been doing that since the 1960s, since before Dunbar did his research. So they actually did this empirically. So it's us and them is the main one, but yeah, there's going to be things like commitment and how much you care about what happens to the wider group. That's going to change slightly as those numbers increase.
Yeah, okay. There's a question here from Louise. Hello, Louise. So Louise is currently redesigning a whole directorate using Team Topologies. So she's a fan of your book, Matthew. Do you think these are directly applicable outside of software? I'm using it for software infrastructure and hardware delivery, as well as business operations around how we deal with budgets, etc. So most of the examples in the book are very software related.
That's a really good question, Louis. So thank you for that. So we deliberately limited the examples and the context in the Team Topologies book to software and infrastructure, building software systems, because that's our experience, that's our expertise, that's where we come from. However, we do know of one mortgage company and one other company in the financial sector, I think, who are using the patterns in Team Topologies outside of a pure software context. They're using them, I think, for their legal and maybe sales and marketing departments. And that's really good. We're happy with that. That's something that we sort of looked forward to. We were hoping that would happen because, the legal department can provide a service. The legal department can define its team API and say, this is what we provide. This is how you can contact us. This is how you can, what you should expect to get from the legal department. And here's the service we can give you. And actually, it seems to be useful to help lots of different groups outside of software to think about the relationship they have with other groups in the organization. So I would absolutely say we know of some organizations doing this, and choose the parts from Team Topologies which don't directly relate to software and cloud and so on. And if they work, then that's great. And we kind of